Chapter 151, The Lady of Death. Chapter text, chapter Civ. The Lady of Death. Captain Gerald looked around himself nervously. He had 2,000 men and 5 dammen. It should have been enough to shatter one of the Westland's armies. They had been assured that the Merethdammin here did not fight in battles between armies, and that the soldiers had no idea how to fight dammen. Yet the string of brutal defeats that the Fox had inflicted on the ever-victorious army told the lie to that tale. Small forces simply vanished. Medium-sized ones were ambushed, taking horrendous casualties, and when they sent out larger forces, the Fox simply faded away. They had killed hundreds of his troops, but given the defeats he kept inflicting on them, he must have had many more, whatever the general said. Gerald was particularly nervous, because he knew that he and his men were bait. The dammen were hidden amongst them, and he'd been ordered to blithely march through this valley, as if they had no cares in the world. Banner General Rildris was ready with 15,000 men and 50 dammen to ambush the ambushers. He had planned this out carefully. Even if the Fox put up wards to prevent Gerald's force from simply traveling away, his dammen could send up a flare for the scouts a safe distance away to see. This time they would run the Fox down. That was the hope. If they did not then, he would likely not be alive to worry about it. A shout came up from his men, and Gerald looked where they were pointing, up the hill. There a few small figures. Many thought at the top. Were they scouts? He could not trigger the trap too soon or the Fox would simply flee. His decision was made for him when a couple of seconds later, the hillside seemed to heave and collapse in on itself, sending rumbles down through the ground. Then that rumbling increased as half the hill came roaring down towards them. The people on the hilltop, they must have been Merethdammin, disappeared in flashes of light as Gerald started to scream orders. A gateway opened, and a Suldam hurried out with her dammen behind her. She bowed low. Banner General Rildris, the signal has been given. Captain Gerald is under attack. Thank you. He gave her a sharp nod and turned to his officers. We know where Gerald is, so I would expect the Fox's forces to be coming down this axis. He pointed to the map. We will trap them between our banners, here, here, and here. As soon as we have moved in the dammen, we'll erect anti-traveling wards to prevent the Fox from fleeing, and then we will squeeze his forces to nothing. It would be good to deal with this problem once and for all. He was sick of fruitless pursuits, tired of seeing his forces whittled away. The last straw might have been 2 nights ago, when his force's baggage train was attacked by wolves of all things. Did this Westlander general now control nature too? Certainly that was the kind of muttering that was now going around his troops. Gerald winced as another bolt of lightning smashed down into the ranks of his troops. What was Rildris doing? He could see a block of troops advancing on him, coming up the road from the south. Too many for him to fight, and his dammen were stretched to their limit trying to protect his forces. Rildris cursed as another gateway fizzled into nothing. Had they erected anti-traveling wards everywhere he wanted his troops to go? He needed to stay calm. He had the forces to win this. He just needed to think. Matt watched with relief as the Ale initiates returned through their gateways. They were tired, he could see that, but they'd keep going and he'd use them for as long as they could. Who would have thought that flaming Aes Sedai would change warfare so much? His mind returned to the battle. Now the Cincian general wasn't brilliant, but he was no fool either. He'd see the gap in the wards that Matt had left sooner or later. Then he'd no doubt go somewhere else, anticipating a trap. The real question was, how many dammen did he have, and how wide could they spread their wards? This was where the gamble came in. If the Cincian could pin his forces in place, that would be it for them. It's time to toss the dice, he muttered before starting to bark orders. Perrin looked up and nodded to yeah. The Cincian have started to travel. It had been difficult explaining to the wolves what Matt wanted to know, but hopefully it would turn out to have been worth the effort. The aleman gave him a nod and opened a gateway. Rildris watched his troops hurrying through the multiple gateways his dammen had opened. Some of the dammen went with the vanguard. They would be weaving their own wards, looking to restrict the mobility of the Fox's troops. Thank you. Matt turned from Perrin towards his squadron of the new weapons. Light knew who had come up with the things, but he'd certainly found some good uses for them, especially combined with the Ale initiates. Sometimes he hated the things he came up with. Then he'd remember that Elaine was trapped in Ebu Dar by the Sintian and what they'd do to her if they caught her. Yer was already hurrying over to join the initiates by the weapons, each of them looking intently at one of the projectiles before moving on. They only had 10 of the things, but that was enough to be devastating. Yer caught his eye and Matt nodded. Yer's voice boomed out. "Be ready. Light the cords." Soldiers touched burning embers to the cords on the back of the metal tubes. "Spin the gateways." A shout made Rildris look away from where his soldiers were still jogging through the gateways. What was that? A number of flashes of light erupted in the air, followed by a thunderous crash. A moment later, a series of explosions rolled through the Sintian troops, tearing holes in their ranks. How had they? "Get the anti-traveling wards back up." Rildris screamed the order. Matt winced as the gateway he had been looking through suddenly snapped shut. He was not stupid enough to put anything through one of those, but it was still far too close to his face. Unfortunately, they seemed to have missed the Sintian general and his damning, but the man would be panicking now. His forces would be separated, able to be dealt with piecemeal. Feeve spun Sedar, drawing on Verin and Alana's strength as she did. Their ridiculous 3 oaths might prevent them from fighting, but they didn't prevent them from linking with someone who wasn't bound by the oaths. However, even with the strength available to her, this was taking too long. Matt's forces were peppering the Sintian with crossbow bolts, but they seemed reluctant to try to directly engage. Instead, they were hunkered down like they expected reinforcements. With a grunt, she spun lightning out of the sky in a storm of bolts, only to see it dispersed by the damning. The 4 of them, she thought it was 4, were working together very well. It was draining, but she kept up the storm of lightning while carefully spinning an inverted web. It was not something she could do particularly quickly, but she would make the time now. Fire and air, not her strongest elements by any means, but she did not want this to be mixed in with the lightning where it might be deflected accidentally. She moved the web into the ground beneath the strongest of the damning and completed it. She could not hear it over the sound of the battle, but she saw the explosion in the midst of the Sintian, and suddenly there was far less Sedar being channeled there. Feeve sagged with relief. She really was starting to hit her limits. Captain Anger was riding at the head of his men. Only 1,000 of them had managed to come through the gateway before it closed unexpectedly, but it would have to be enough. Gerald was stuck, under attack, and it was the duty of his fellow officers to come to his aid. He knew other columns of troops, larger than his, would be converging through the hills, ready to crush the Fox's forces between their hammers and Gerald's anvil. He glanced over at the pair of tired-looking dammen riding with his forces. They would be weaving and reweaving anti-traveling wards as they went. It was the only way they had found to prevent the Fox from simply opening gateways in the middle of their forces and letting loose with his Mareth dammen. However, there was a balance that needed to be struck. If he exhausted his dammen too much by forcing them to extend the wards too widely, they would be in no condition to fight when he did encounter the enemy. Yer looked down at the Sintian cavalry force, several hundred of them, soft wetlanders riding horses rather than using their own 2 feet. One volley and we are gone. Matt's soldiers nodded and hurried to line up. A shout came up from the Sintian. They had been spotted. He prepared himself to dance with their dammen if he needed to. Moments later, 50 crossbow bolts flew down into the Sintian. They would not wait to see the results. He was already spinning a gateway, Matt's men leaping through it to make their escape. General Rildris sighed as lay down in his tent, safely under the dammen's anti-traveling wards. He was exhausted, having worked into the early hours of the morning. That had been a disaster. It would have been worse if not for the quick action of some of his more junior officers, but there was still no other way to characterize it. Gerald's force had been wiped out almost to the last man. His own relief forces had suffered heavy casualties. Over 500 soldiers dead from the various groups trying to reach Gerald, plus those killed by the explosions here. He would need to ask for reinforcements. That was not going to be a pleasant conversation. The quiet of the countryside suddenly came to an end as a gigantic hole rotated open in the air. Immediately, the overwhelming sound of boots on the dirt, horses, armor clinking, and shouted commands rang forth. Moments later, an army started to march through the hole. Rank upon rank of armored men, some with pikes, others with crossbows, still more on horses. The banners of various noble houses flew among them, along with the Lion of Andor, the Bees of Ilion, the rising sun of Kerhian, and the crescent moons of Tyr. But above them all flew two banners. The ancient sign of the Aes Sedai, sinuously divided circle on a red background, and the dragon's personal banner, the strange creature standing rampant. Nearby more, smaller gateways opened, and ale poured through them, black veiled with spears at the ready. Coilin watched from the walls of Ebu Dar as troops arranged themselves around the city. It seemed that the Westlands had mustered a response. Faster than had been thought possible, too. He was not sure how many soldiers there were out there, but it was certainly a lot. The Merethdammin and Oathbreakers were no doubt determined to prevent the return. Still, perhaps with this, the Fox would stop his attacks on the city, and the armies could fight in a more civilized fashion. Eben and Helena sat on the boat, her wearing a stolen damane dress, him under an illusion making him look like a sul'dam. The rowers looked at them nervously as they moved them towards the Rahad. Understandably, people were uncomfortable enough about channelers, but the leashed channelers of their conquerors were a whole different matter. Accompanying them and completing the illusion of their disguise were several of Queen Tylin's guard, dressed in captured Tzeentchian armor. The Tzeentchians' control of the main city had been tightening, and it was becoming harder and harder to evade them, let alone to strike against them. That was why they were heading for the Rahad. They'd heard the whispers about what was going on there, the struggles the Tzeentchian were having controlling it, the resistance there. They could do more to help the fight there. They would just have to find the resistance leader. The Ebu Dari called her. They assumed it was a her, the Lady Mother. The Tzeentchian called her the Lady of Death, or if they were particularly drunk, the Lady of Vengeance. Rianne stood in an alleyway, watching, her arms full of cheap cloths. The Tzeentchian had increased the strength of their patrols, and so Elaine had had them fade into the background again. Let the Tzeentchian feel just a little bit safer. The clever ones already knew that the Rahad was not a safe place for them, that it never would be. However, the stupid ones. She had allowed them to imagine that they had made part of the Rahad safe. It was easy enough for what was left of the kin to pass the word that there would be no attacks in the Fisher's quarter. Rianne shook her head. She was not quite sure how it had happened, but somehow over time, the girl had gone from tentative ally to undisputed leader of their little group. Still, who would have thought a girl of her age would be so bloodthirsty? She truly seemed to hate the Tzeentchian, other than the damning. She caught the eye of Kaline, one of the windfinders across the street. Who would have thought they could channel too? They were ready. It only took another minute for the Tzeentchian to come down the wider main street. Perhaps 20 soldiers, 6 damning, and in the middle of it, a palanquin that, if Elaine was right, held one of the Tzeentchian nobility. They must have been confident that it was safe, or one of their blood would not be coming here. The lack of attacks would have helped with that, and no doubt they thought that 6 damning was too strong a force for anyone to attack. Light, they could probably take on an army with them. Rianne took a deep breath. She was over 400, too old for fighting really, but she was ready. Elaine had said that she would give the signal. Rianne winced at the thought. The girl had a rather unique way of signaling when she chose to take the field personally. With a roar, the ground exploded into fire, blasting shards of rock into the Tzeentchian formation. Elaine's inverted weaves, or webs as she called them, were a miracle. Rianne was not sure she believed the girl's stories about an Aes Sedai from the Age of Legends, but wherever she had learnt that it certainly was not at the White Tower. Before the broken bodies had had time to land, Rianne was already channeling. She could not invert her weaves at any useful speed, but of course her ability was still concealed, the same way as every other member of their groups was. She wove air and water together, ripping shards of it through one of the damning. It was a tragedy, but they had learnt very quickly that these women did not want to be freed, that they would fight to stay in captivity. In their current state, hunted as they were, they could not keep unwilling captives. Then she had no time to think, as one of the remaining damning launched fire at her. High Lord Finan exploded. You dare to come here and tell me that you traitors have captured one of the blood and wish to ransom a damning for him. You dare say this to my face. His eyes were lowered by his loss of temper, but this was truly insufferable. The Ebu Deri man kneeling in front of him had the temerity to look up and meet his eyes. "That's not quite how I'd put it, my lord. I've just been asked to deliver a message. I've got nothing to do with them, the lady, but sometimes when you're asked you've got to do it right." The insolence was unbearable. "Kill him and put his head on a spike where they will see it. Put a notice that anyone aiding criminals will be executed, and unless Lord Arlen is returned unharmed, punishments will be creatively harsh." Maghidian ambled through Luz Thurin's camp. Her disguise as one of the dedicated spear maidens ensured that none of the soldiers there would challenge or otherwise bother her. As she went, she made a note of everything she saw. The Cinchen would find this information helpful. There was no doubt that they were a threat to the shadow, but they were a brittle one that could easily be broken. For now, she wanted them tying up as much of Luz Thurin and the Hall's attention as possible. High Lord Finan did his best to suppress his rage. "Explain." His voice was dangerously quiet. The prostrated officer hesitated and then started to speak. "High Lord, the traitors and rebels. In the night they took the head of the man you punished for Lord Arlen's kidnap and replaced it with Lord Arlen's head. They added words around it too. Was the head not guarded? Yes, High Lord, but the guards were found dead, their throats cut." High Lord Finan took a deep breath. "What did the words say?" The officer squirmed, hopefully in fear. "They said, 'The Cinchen are murderous traitors to the light. The people of Ebu Dar spit on the Empress, and any atrocity against the Ebu Deri will be repaid twice over.' This could not be tolerated. A series of public executions, perhaps. They had these people's queen and her heir. Perhaps an example could be made of one of them very publicly. Have the words been removed?" "Yes, High Lord." He could sense her, but in there. He could not be having with subordinates hiding things from him too. And they had done something with the One Power. The words were made using the One Power by Merith Damin, but when the Damin attempted to unravel them, it triggered some kind of unseen trap. How many? 3 Damin and Suldam, along with several soldiers. Demandrid stepped out of his inverted gateway. There, Luz Thurin's forces in the distance. Too many for him to take on by himself. He had no intention of being caught up in one of their battles and accidentally ending up as collateral damage. However, causing them some trouble that would be both helpful and enjoyable. He spun Sedin, drawing through his angriel, and lightning flashed down from the sky, landing amidst the troops without warning. Demandrid did not wait to see the results of his attack. He was already stepping away through another gateway. Perhaps he would be back next time. He felt he needed to vent some frustration in a productive way. Olivia jerked upright, her washcloth forgotten, as she felt a hand descend firmly onto her backside with a thwack. Without thinking, she embraced Sedar, outrage flowing through her. Then she hesitated, fear flashing across her face as she looked up at the leering man. If she channeled, she'd reveal herself. They'd all know she was Damin. He wasn't sure what to do, her face heating with humiliation and futile rage that she knew a Damin shouldn't feel. Her internal conflict came to an end as Talon's hand landed on the man's shoulder, grasping him by the coat and hauling him towards the door. The man struggled, shouting protests under the larger innkeeper's grip, but was relentlessly propelled out. As soon as he was gone, Talon hurried back and helped Olivia to her feet. "I'm sorry about that, Olivia. We're a respectable establishment here. We don't tolerate that kind of behavior here. If anyone touches you, you make them to stop or come and find me." Suldam had protected her sometimes. They would insist that she was a good Damin and not deserving of punishment, but this felt different. Maybe it was that she was allowed to stop them herself. No Damin could ever do that. Tell them to speak to Jonah. She will be able to see to getting the children fed. Elaine turned away from the wise woman, her red belt long since hidden, and faced Rian. "How are the food stocks holding up?" Life in the Rahad had never been easy for its people. She had known that intellectually before the Cinchen attacked. Since then she had experienced it directly, eating no more than they did, living the same life that they had. However, since Rand had arrived and besieged the city, things had become far harder. Food was becoming scarce, and the situation was only getting worse as time went on. She had already started thinking about what more they could do. The Cinchen were still bringing food into the city, of course they were, but very little made it to the rebellious Rahad. The obvious solution would be to travel to the main city, but after her assassination of one of their generals, the Tzeentchen had put up wards across the bay as well. They really were vexing. Davil could barely contain his excitement. He was going to meet the Lady Mother. It had only been scant weeks since the Tzeentchen had occupied Ebu Dar. No one had ever heard of her before, but now her name echoed on the lips of every man and woman in the Rahad. The woman who protected the people of the Rahad, who led the fight against the Tzeentchen. Personally, he thought that she must be an Aes Sedai. No one else could do what she did. Balaam was insistent that she was one of the wise women empowered by the Creator to save them. One man had said he didn't think she existed. He'd been beaten up for that. In the end, it didn't matter who she was, though. Almost every man in the Rahad would die for her. They didn't need to know any more than that. He heard a door open, and then his blindfold was pulled off. There were 3 people sat in front of him. One was a man, perhaps sea folk based on his dark skin. Obviously not him. The other a golden-haired girl, attractive, but younger than him, then a middle-aged woman with a hard face. He turned to her and bowed low. "Lady Mother, it is an honor. I have information that you need to know." He might be from the Rahad, but he knew his manners. For some reason, the girl grimaced when he used the title. The woman winced slightly. "I think it is Elaine Sedai you want to be addressing." Elaine Sedai, the girl. No one was smiling. Clearly it wasn't a joke, and no one with the tiniest bit of sense pretended to be Aes Sedai. He hurriedly turned to the girl. "My apologies, Lady Mother. Elaine Sedai. Greendale rode on her ornate palanquin through the streets of Ebu Dar. Suitably disguised, of course. She could not say that she was a fan of the fashions of the Tzeentchen nobility, but being able to simply spin an illusion did make it easier to fit in. After her last encounter with the Tzeentchen, she had been somewhat hesitant to return to them, but needs must. Their conflict with Luz Thurin and the Hall was too much of an opportunity to miss. She wanted a High Lord, and she was not going to be discouraged. Taija watched as rank upon rank of Tzeentchen troops formed up on the other side of the plain. They'd been engaged in an extended dance with the Army of the Light, with both sides trying to pin each other down in skirmishes. The Tzeentchen forces had carefully stayed separate, under anti-traveling wards, taking advantage of the number of leashed that they had at their disposal. With fewer channelers available to Rand, he'd kept his forces together, instead looking to take the Tzeentchen forces piecemeal while leaving enough behind to maintain the siege on Ebu Dar. Still, it seemed that dance was coming to an end. No doubt the Tzeentchen now expected a conventional battle, soldiers stabbing each other, channelers throwing lightning. Heh! They didn't even seem to be thinking about cover. Sedar surged from the Tzeentchen lines. Both sides were under extensive anti-traveling wards. There'd be no bouncing around there, just a slugging match. Fireballs started to arc through the air, lightning flashed down from the sky. Rand's troops grounded their spears and prepared for combat. Taija joined the tower Aes Sedai among the army of the light, unraveling and deflecting what she could. There must have been well over 100 damning in the force facing her. 20 tower Aes Sedai her. Rand and Tel were not a great match for that. Some things got through, tearing holes in Rand's lines. More no doubt would if this went on for long. However, the Tzeentchen were committed at that point, and that was the key. Taija glanced at Rand sitting on his horse surrounded by banners. Foolish, really, it made him a target, but she supposed neither side was used to the kind of warfare she was yet. He wasn't looking at her, but towards the Tzeentchen. After a moment he nodded at something Taija couldn't see. A burst of green light exploded in the sky above them with a rolling boom produced by unseen webs. Then Taija felt it, a gigantic amount of Sedar being channeled. She knew there'd be even more Sedin. The Tzeentchen thought the greatest threat to them was the White Tower. They were wrong. Somewhere out of her sight, although she could point straight at her, was Egwene with the silver belt Sangreal, linked with Jaha using Kalendor and a few other aspirants. The center of the Tzeentchen lines simply ceased to exist in a white-hot storm of fire. Egwene dragged the conflagration along the Tzeentchen lines, obliterating them as she went. There was nothing they could do. Even fleeing wasn't possible with the wards they'd trapped themselves under. It was a slaughter. Taija had seen footage from the couple of times that had happened in her time, before both sides started to hold back on using Sangreal against each other. But being there, it was different, more visceral. It wasn't long before the Tzeentchen broke, running in terror from that wall of fire. Much as Taija despised them, the slaughter was still enough to make her feel ill. She suspected Egwene wouldn't mind at all, though. It was the end of the day, and Roderick had invited Olivia and Gillian to try some new pastries that he was experimenting with. It was more than exciting. Olivia loved pastries, and Roderick made her feel different, like she was a real person, a pretty one. She could never let him go beyond flirting, of course. She wasn't even sure whether she wanted to or not, but if she did, he'd find out the truth, and then she'd have to go back to being damning again, and she wasn't ready for that. Now wasn't the time for morbid thoughts like that, though. Now was the time for pastries and friends. Chapter 152. A Walk in the Park. Chapter CXV. A Walk in the Park banner. General Rildris watched High Lord Devlin study the maps. He had been looking at them for long minutes, but that was all right. The High Lord was one of the greatest generals alive. As far as Rildris was concerned, if he had not been in charge, then casualties from the Fox, and now this new super weapon the Westlanders had shown, would have been far higher. He had turned a war-ending catastrophe into a mere disaster, and Rildris doubted many other men or women could have done so. Eventually, High Lord Devlin looked up. For now, we will stay in Ebu Dar. We will need to consider countermeasures to the new tactics used by the Westlanders. However, while we stay in the city, we negate their advantages. They will not use their superweapons against us, where they would kill their own people, and the Fox's tactics are nothing against a static target under wards. One of the stupider generals spoke up. What about supplies, High Lord? Are we not besieged? High Lord Devlin gave him a look that made his opinion of the man's intellect clear. With gateways, our logistics lines are shortened. We will have no trouble keeping the city supplied. Calren stepped out of the gateway onto the dirt road leading to the small village, Dabney Field, if he remembered correctly from the briefing before they had come. In his head, he rehearsed some of the answers he'd been practicing for common questions, the sorts of things that were asked of every recruiting party. Inalair was leading this one. They all wore the formal black coats of the hall, hers and Baran's with the red patch of an aspirant, his and Dialna's unadorned. With them were a squad of 5 men in shining armor in the colors of the Army of the Light. After all, even if people couldn't channel, they could still serve Aes Sedai and the Light. As they came into the village, it quickly became clear that something was wrong. It was too quiet. Now that he thought about it, the fields outside had been empty. He looked around nervously, and when he felt the goosebumps of the 2 women embracing Sedar, he seized Sedin. There's Sedar being channeled ahead of us. Inalair sounded nervous. She hesitated, then came to a decision. The villagers may be in trouble, or it might be the White Tower. We'll go ahead carefully. Be ready for anything. Calren spared a moment to pray to the Creator. He really hoped this wasn't trouble. Neither of the aspirants was much of a fighter. They were better with people, which he supposed was why they were here with the recruiting party rather than off with the Army of the Light, or assigned to defend the hall. Rian stared sullenly at the ground as these Sinchen, as they called themselves, walked along the line of villagers. Light knew what they were doing, but they had already picked out one of the women, dragging her away and putting a collar on her. Light. It was wrong. They were all decent folk in Dabney Field, not the sort to put collars or leashes on anyone. These people couldn't just arrive in their village and do this to them. Only they could. He glanced at the still smoking corpse of Lestol, the village mayor. They'd made it clear that that was what would happen to anyone who protested. Their eyes said I would do that to them. He shuddered. All he could do was pray that they didn't take anyone else, that no one else got hurt. He was fervently muttering prayers to the Creator, or anyone who would listen, when he realized the square had gone silent. He looked up. A small group of people had just stopped at the edge of the village square, their mouths dropped open in shock. 4 of them in long black coats, accompanied by 5 soldiers, one of them holding a banner he didn't recognize. A divided circle on red. Calren stood in shock for valuable moments, trying to work out what he was seeing. The dead body, the first he'd ever seen. Insect helmets, leashed women. His shock was broken when fire erupted towards them and then vanished. Light, Sinchen. He'd thought he was safe from the war with them as a mere initiate. What were they doing here? They were leagues from the coast. He spun earth, throwing a boulder at one of the insect-helmeted men. Fire flashed towards him, and he saw Barand was spinning fire of his own, looking determined. His boulder smashed one of the Cinchen soldiers aside, and this time he spun fire, aiming for another soldier. "The damning you idiot! Hit them!" Barand frantically shouted the words even as he sent his own fire spiraling towards the Cinchen. It vanished, and then suddenly lightning speared out of the clear sky, straight into the man. 1 second he'd been there, a kind, gentle man who went out of his way to help new initiates. The next a charred corpse was collapsing. Calran nearly lost his grasp on Sedin. He stood, staring in shock while explosions rumbled between Inalair and the Damin. The villagers were all fleeing for cover. She glanced back at him, strain on her face. "Dialna, Calran, run." He shook himself out of his stupor, began to spin again. This time Inalair screamed the words, "Run." "Someone needs to get word back to the hall. Go." He hesitated a second longer and then turned to run, closely followed by Dialna. He couldn't spin a gateway by himself. Maybe if he linked with her. He wasn't sure he could remember the web. Maybe she would. They'd go and get help. Aes Sedai or any Aes Sedai. Then they'd come back and everything would be all right. Taija stood by Rand as she looked over at Ebu Dar's walls. It was a worrying conundrum. On the one hand, his forces could just obliterate the entire city, but that would kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Storming the city, the conventional way, would result in massive casualties for both sides, not to mention the Ebu Dari. Maybe the various captives that had been obtained would be able to give some information that would help with that, but she doubted it. So for now Rand had besieged the city, although Taija wasn't sure how effective that was when the Cinchen seemed to have come up with an arrangement to allow them to bring in supplies. She glanced over at Min, who was hovering around as usual, and sidled over to her. "Is he all right?" Min winced slightly. "He's worried. This is distracting from what's important. He can't just sit here with his forces tied up for months while the shadow gets stronger." She was right, but Taija had been discussing an idea with Tel. The Cinchen had been bringing in supplies on the far side of the city, up against the bay where they were well out of sight of the Army of the Light, and where they could safely lower the wards with only the sea unprotected. They needed to be discouraged from that, and to do that Taija needed to get into the city. So a few days later, Taija and Tel were dressed in what she was assured were typical Ebu Dari outfits. Taija glanced over at Egwene, who gave her a nod. Time to go. The wards over their small section of Rand's lines were temporarily down. The light of Sedar sprung up around Egwene, merging with her circle. Calendor blazing in the middle of it. Spirit and fire reached out to Ebu Dar, and while Taija couldn't see it at that distance, a moment later the Cinchen anti-traveling wards were torn down like paper. Egwene and her circle were already relocating, while Taija spun an inverted gateway into the city for her and Tel. Elaine looked up in surprise as a huge source of Sedar blazed into her awareness. Moments later, the ever-present anti-traveling wards vanished. She could leave. She glanced around the room, saw lean, hungry faces. Some of the women were also looking towards that source of Sedar. One of the wise women sat weeping in the corner. She had been collared for 2 weeks before they rescued her, the only one who had been taken out of the Rahad that they had been able to rescue. Elaine hesitated. Her mother would explode if she ever found out about this, but these people needed her here. If she vanished, the whole resistance would collapse. Her mind went back to how they could get more food for the people of the Rahad. There was less and less to be had there. The people were suffering, and she was going hungry with them. How could she do anything else? Of course the Cinchen were bringing food into the main city, but clearly Lord Finan saw it as just punishment for the district's rebelliousness to starve them. She could even understand the logic of it, except most people in the Rahad were mere civilians, uninvolved in the conflict. It had been easy enough to blend in amongst the main city's reasonably cosmopolitan population, at least as long as Taija kept away from the Cinchen administrative centers. She rather wanted to go and check out the Terracin Palace, as that seemed to be where they were keeping the leashed, but Tel wouldn't let her, especially once they'd worked out that the Cinchen were checking everyone there with slicing webs. He'd still refused, even when Taija had protested that Elaine or Helena might be there. He was right, really. They had a mission, and even working together, the two of them could still be overwhelmed by enough leashed. Taija really hoped that Elaine and the others were free, but if they weren't, the best way to help them was to smash the Cinchen. They'd know that she'd never abandon them. So instead, they dedicated their time to ambling around, looking innocent, figuring out the shape of the anti-traveling wards, and simply talking to people. Interestingly, the Rahad seemed to be very restive, barely under Tseentchen control if Taija read between the lines. A mysterious leader, the Lady Mother to the Ebu Dari loyalists, the Lady of Death or Vengeance to the Tseentchen and their collaborators. It was definitely something to report back when she left the city, but Taija wasn't sure there was much she could do with the information at that point. Hopefully, the rebel leader was looking after Elaine. So Taija devoted her mind to mapping out the anti-traveling wards around the city. They'd been sensible enough, putting some in place to segment the place, so she couldn't just go from one side of the city to another by gateway, and it would be important for later to know where those lines between wards were. It was really quite sad seeing that beautiful city despoiled by the vileness of the Tseentchen, and Taija found herself feeling nostalgic for her first date with Tell in this time, and how she'd persuaded him to break into the Terracin Palace with her to look at frescoes. The Tseentchen kept the park that they brought supplies into very secure when they had the wards down. Taija had a look, and had had to turn away hurriedly more than once to avoid being checked by patrols of leashed and leash holders. It was a pity. Her first thought had been to simply try to walk in at a key time and then start wreaking havoc, but it seemed like she'd need a distraction. Fortunately, the Tseentchen were pretty predictable. Always a mistake, probably because they weren't really used to gateway-based warfare. When they weren't using the park for supplies, it was open to the city's upper classes, Ebu Dari and Tseentchen. Taija and Tell took the opportunity to go for a stroll, a rich merchant woman courting a delightful man. She wasn't quite sure about Tell's choice of colors for his outfit, but he insisted pink was in with the Ebu Dari gentry. It gave them both the chance to amble through the place, spinning some interesting, inverted wards with contingent triggers. The next time someone opened a gateway in the park, it would start a countdown, and then things would get interesting. Romantic stroll complete, the two of them headed back to the room they'd rented near the park to wait. You'd look so pretty in them, though. Ghislaine held the ribbons up in front of her. Olivia shook her head again. No, I don't like them. She'd been allowed to put ribbons in her hair when she'd been a good damin. She didn't want to think about that. Fine, fine. Ghislaine gave her an assessing look. Maybe a scarf, something light. It'll bring out your color and make up for your boring dress. My dress isn't boring. Olivia was a little amazed she was able to speak so vehemently to Ghislaine. She should be punished harshly for speaking like that too well to anyone. But her dress wasn't boring. It was brown, not grey. Ghislaine waved a scarf in front of her, and her thought processes were pulled away. It did look thin and very colorful. Maybe it would look good on her and help her pretend not to be damning. Chapter 153. Taita is a good damning. Chapter text, chapter CXVI. Taita is a good damning. Elaine sat in the boat as it was rowed across the bay. As far as she had been able to tell from her informers, the Tseentchen brought in supplies two ways. One was to bring down the anti-traveling wards around one of the parks in the city for short periods of time. The other was to sail their large, boxy ships out of the bay to where they were no longer under the wards, and then transfer supplies to them that way before returning them to the docks. It seemed inefficient, but in the context of the whole siege, she supposed it made sense. They would want to keep as many avenues open as possible, and any gap in the wards might be exploited. She was dressed in the clothes of a former Sul'dam. The unfortunate woman would not be needing them anymore. On her wrist was a bracelet attached to a leash connecting her to a collar around Rianne's neck. The woman did a good job of looking like a typical damning, submissive and quiet. Of course, the Adam was not real. With one to study, it had been easy enough to have something made that simply looked like one. Although she had the feeling if she really wanted to, she could have made a real one too. She would have to talk to Taija about that, when the city had been freed. The rowers took them to the main city's docks, not far from where one of the Tseentchen ships was docked. This would be the dangerous part. Elaine hauled herself onto the stone pier, tugging Rianne behind her and followed by the rest on the boat. Even the rowers. An officer came hurrying over to them. He glanced at her dress and bowed. Sul'dam, welcome back from the Rahad. I trust you have all returned safely. Yes, thank you. She kept her reply short, doing her best to imitate the slurred accent of the Cincian, almost the polar opposite of Taija's clipped tones. Good, good. The man realized she had not stopped walking and hurried to follow. The inspections, Durseldom, we must check you. Elaine reached into her pouch and pulled out a letter, flashing it quickly at him without breaking her stride. We are on urgent business and must report directly to High Lord Finan with all haste if we do not wish to end up as Dakuvale. The Cincian truly were disgusting. We have no time to spare. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and Elaine noticed more attention being paid by nearby people on the docks. It had been too much to hope for that they would be able to keep sneaking people across the bay under webs of illusion. Still, she was almost off the pier. She put on a more conciliatory tone. Of course, of course. I understand the need with these oathbreakers. Can we please do it on the move, though? My report for the High Lord truly is urgent. She pretended to look around and then zeroed in on a damning near one of the ships. Perhaps that one. She is nearby. The suspicion left the officer's face. Of course, Durseldom, I would not wish to delay you any more than is utterly necessary. He waved to the Damin and her Soldom. You there, you are needed to check the Durseldom and her party. He looked back to see Elaine's rowers following too and hesitated. Thank you, Captain. We shall be on our way momentarily. Elaine pulled his attention back to her. Of course. Where are you from, by the way? I had thought you had a Crowan accent, but I cannot quite place it. Originally, before I joined the ever-victorious army, how they would have to change its name soon, I was born in a small village that rests in the shadow of, well, you would not have heard of it, one of the larger mountains in the far south. The officer looked unconvinced, but they had gone far enough. As he opened his mouth to reply, she spun Sedar. A small inverted web of air caught his foot. Another pushed his head forward. He slammed face first into the cobbles of the dark side with a crunch as something broke. Elaine gasped theatrically and raised her voice. The captain has fallen and hurt himself. Somebody help him. I think he is badly injured. People were coming towards them now, gathering perfect. One of her rowers came running up. Stavin, an Ebu Dari sailor and a good man. He knelt down beside the captain, concern over his face. I think he is badly hurt. He needs help. Anyone further away than Elaine would not have seen him slip a thin dirk out of his sleeve and up into the Cincian officer's armpit. The Cincian were much closer by then, coming running to help the poor officer or just to see what the commotion was about. They seemed tense, but unworried given the lack of fighting. It was probably time to give the signal. Elaine spun inverted fire and earth, aiming for the Damin. Moments later, cobblestones exploded under their feet, shredding the poor women. Then a whole group was moving. Rianne and Helena discarded the collars round their necks. A pity to lose good silver, but needs must. The rowers, including Eben, caught up with them at a sprint, and then they were running for the Cincian ship. Webs flashed out from them, no time for inverting, and Cincian died where they stood. They did not seem to have worked out what was happening yet. In less than a minute, they were all scrambling up the Cincian ship's gangplank. Newly arrived, hopefully full of food and supplies to keep the people of the Rahad alive a little bit longer. There were only a few Cincian on board. They died fast, barely having time to react before they were cut apart by webs of air. Then it was all business. 4 of the sea folk men, Sestia the Soul, surviving sea folk sailmistress, and a couple of Ebu Dari men who were familiar with ships, were to be the crew. The 2 sea folk windfinders would be helping them. Elaine, Helena, Eben, and Rianne's job was to make sure they lived long enough to be useful. Webs of air flashed out, slicing through the ropes attaching the ship to the dark side, and then in a concerted effort, they all channeled thick cables of air between the ship and shore, slowly pushing it away. Above them, the sails were already unfurling, Sestia taking the tiller and the windfinders channeling huge flows of air into the canvas. Elaine saw a gateway rotating open on the dark side and sent a bar of fire straight through it. The gateway snapped shut again. She could feel the ship starting to move under her, creaking as its sails caught the artificial wind. It did not feel like long before the ship was lumbering quite rapidly across the bay, leaving the main city docks behind. Elaine was feeling the strain, stood on the stern of the ship, dueling with the growing number of Damin on the dark side. Lightning flashed down from the sky, and she diverted it harmlessly into the turbulent water of the bay. He decided to return the favor, sparing some her strength to send her own lightning spearing down into the dark side. Just a bit longer to hold out. The Cinchen were sensible enough not to open their gateways at completely predictable times, but Taija still knew they did it at least every other day. The first sign was always when polite soldiers started to clear the park, and that was what she'd been keeping an eye out for. In no time, she and Tell were spinning disguises over themselves. The illusion of a grey dress and collar appearing over Taija while Tell flickered and transforms into a rather podgy leash holder. It was the only way to hide his bulk. Taija looked him over with displeasure. I still don't see why I have to be the leashed. Quiet girl, or you'll be punished. He threateningly shook the illusionary leash at her. Taija humphed at him and considered trying to gross him out, but no, there wasn't actually anything funny about those leashes. She didn't want to joke about them. Whatever, Tell sighed. Seriously though, look at me. Have you ever seen a fat leashed? They wouldn't let it happen. He did have a point there. Elaine could feel the sweat trickling down her back, and it was not from the heat. One of the sea folk was dead, burnt away along with one of the spars on the ship's rigging. There were several holes in its hull too, but she was fairly sure they were nearly there. With fire and spirit, she sliced a pair of fireballs arcing towards them, and then reached out with tendrils of spirit. Yes, there. They were past the edge of the anti-traveling ward that prevented gateways between the Rahad and the main city. We are past it. Get below. As Eben, Helena, and Rianne scurried off, she looked out ahead, towards the Rahad. It looked like there was a welcoming committee gathering there too. More damning. Yes, that was a fireball arcing overhead towards them. She winced as the ship shook from the impact of something, one problem at a time. It was still some way away, but she carefully reached out with inverted spirit towards the inverted webs she had tied off under the docks in the Rahad a few days before. A moment later, they exploded with a roar. Excellent. There would not be any more fireballs coming from there for a while. She refocused herself on keeping the attacks from the main city off the ship. She would not have to hold out much longer. Rianne opened herself up to the link and found herself pulled in immediately. Sedar flowing through her as she joined with Eben and Helena. It was an odd sensation. Normally she could feel the people she was linked with, but they were opaque to her. Still, there was no time to think about it. Helena was weaving. Something inverted, slow as a consequence too, but she knew what was coming. After a few seconds, a large gateway opened in the ship's hold, leading straight through to one of their many hidden storerooms. Burly men were already reacting, leaping through from the room to start pulling sacks out of the ship and through the gateway. Rianne, Eben, and Helena wasted no time in joining them. Taija was already on the street, eyes cast down when she heard the explosion in the park. Tell immediately broke into a lumbering run, her trailing after him. No one was going to be checking a leash holder and her leashed when they were running to respond to an emergency. They came into the park to see chaos. The gateways were gone, sadly. It would have been good to send something back through them. However, piles of supplies were lying around, along with Cinchen bodies. They glanced at each other and Tell started bellowing in a terrible imitation of a Cinchen accent to let him through, that his Tate I could heal the injured. Tate. Taija was going to have to get him back for that. If she'd persuaded him to be the least, she'd have called him Telly. Unfortunately, his shouts suddenly drew every eye to the two of them, and they weren't welcoming looks. Did the Cinchen not have healing? Oh well, it had been worth a try. They didn't even shout anything. There were immediately a pair of leashed attacking. They must really have been paranoid. Taija wondered why. That lady person, maybe. You deal with the supplies. I'll take the Cinchen. That worked for Taija. She turned away from Tell. The leash was just an illusion anyway and spun fire into a stack of crates. They erupted into satisfying flame, and she took a moment to spin earth and fire into the ground under a group of confused-looking Cinchen soldiers. Then it was on to more supplies, a group of wagons. In a second they were merrily burning, and then Taija had to duck a web of air. She shot Tell an annoyed glance, but he was well engaged with three leashed, all quite strong. Fair enough. Still. In a fit of pique, Taija picked up one of the burning wagons with air and flung it at the offending leashed and her leash holder. Impressively, the woman batted it aside, but missed the inverted web of air that was behind it. Taija was already turning back to destroying the supplies that were keeping the city fed. One of the leashed Tell was fighting tumbled past her with her leash holder, both broken in too many places to count. It didn't take long for Taija to finish with the supplies in the park. Still, that was only a day or two's worth. Tell, done, let's go. He glanced over at her, blasted one of the leash straight through her leash holder, and then they were both running through a gateway he'd spun. They came out right at the edge of one of the city's internal divisions in the wards. A few steps, and they were on the other side. Another gateway, and they emerged outside a huge warehouse, the Cinchon's main store for supplies before they were distributed. Tell raised an eyebrow and Taija sighed before placing herself on the edge of embracing Sedar. A moment later she was linked, him drawing Sedar through her. Taija resisted the urge to struggle. Even with Tell, who despite everything she was deeply in love with, she didn't like it at all. He gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze, and the guards in front of the warehouse vanished in brief explosions. At least he understood her discomfort. A moment later he was looking at the sky, sending up a huge red flare, and then he could focus on the real reason they'd linked. Tell stared at the warehouse, and Taija could see the flows of Sedar mixing in with invisible Sedin. The warehouse started to shake, more and more violently, until suddenly it simply collapsed in on itself, and flames started to lick from the inside. That should do it. Tell released the link straight away, and Taija breathed a sigh of relief. Seconds later, a huge pulse of the power from outside the city brought down the wards, and the two of them traveled out again. The ship shook again. It was barely moving now, almost all of its sails burnt away. The forward mast had already gone over the side. Elaine did not think she could hold out much longer. There were too many damning. No, she had promised herself she would not be stupid. She was not going to test herself by trying to hold out past the point of safety. It was time to go. "Get below, we are leaving." She shouted the words to Sestia and the two windfinders. They would get the rest of the crew off, those that were still alive. They did not protest, immediately hurrying off. It was amazing what hardship had done with all of these people, with her too. Where before a bunch of arrogant women might have fought and argued, sadly including her, now they were a perfect unit. They each knew their role and acted without hesitating. It had saved their lives more than once. Elaine winced as lightning struck far too close, and then gathered her strength, water and air together. A huge spout of water blasted into the air just in front of her. As it fell, she dived for the hatchway, spinning an illusion of her own unconscious body lying there. She half climbed, half fell down the ladders into the main hold to see it looking satisfyingly empty. There were still some crates and sacks, but not many. The ship shook again above her. "Everybody out. We have what we came for. Go." As the men and women scrambled for the gateway, she carefully wove a couple of inverted webs, thought for a second, and then added some conditionality to them. Then, after another moment, a couple more that would be easier to find. Not enough time to do a proper job of it, sadly. Seconds later, she was following the others through the gateway. Galen stood on the prow of the small galley as they approached the hulk that had once been one of the larger ships in the Cinchian Navy. She'd heard all the mutters about the Lady of Death when she'd been assigned to search the ship. Of course she had. Even the damning were talking about her, although they were punished for it. Not her Kika, though. She was a good one. She smiled fondly at the older, collared damning, then held her hand up. "That's close enough. Kika, check the ship." They waited while Kika stared at it. One of the officers moved impatiently as if he was about to say something, but she quelled him with a glance. Kika would have as long as she needed. She was a good damning. She wouldn't tarry unnecessarily, and Galen had no desire to walk straight into one of the ladies' traps. After a couple more long minutes, Kika looked away from the ship. "I cannot feel anything on the decks, but there might be something inside." Galen gave a sharp nod. "Very well. Let's get on board, but take care. Do not go below decks until Kika's checked there too, and whatever you do, do not touch anything." Cinchian swarmed up onto the deck, soon followed by Galen and Kika climbing up a rope ladder that they'd lowered after them. "We will go below and check for more traps." That was in fact the last thing she wanted to do, but she knew her duty. A few minutes later, Galen emerged, Kika trailing behind her. "We found a couple of traps, and Kika has disarmed them. It looks like they have stolen the cargo. You may go below." As the Cinchian started to go below decks to work out why the Lady of Death had wanted the ship stolen, a tied-off web that had been triggered by Kika's careful unweaving of the two webs she had spotted kept on decaying at a steady rate. Galen turned to look towards the main city. She would be glad to. Her thought process was interrupted as the deck exploded under her. High Lord Feenan resisted the urge to throw something at the kneeling officer. So you are telling me that this traitor Oathbreaker killed half the people on the docks, stole a ship, escaped from it, and then blew it up with more Sincian on board in the middle of the bay? Why? Why would she do that? I do not know, High Lord. Perhaps she hoped to use the ship against us, or simply to sow chaos. I do not want speculation. I want answers. Find me them. He ignored the man as he scrambled out of the audience chamber. He also needed to consider the lady's other attack on the park and the main city's supplies. Did she think she could starve the Sincian out of the city? Of course, the lady was not the only problem. With the city besieged, the Ebu Dari queen was becoming less and less helpful. She had sworn the oaths, but they all knew that was a polite fiction when faced with overwhelming force. Perhaps if an example were to be made of her. He gestured, and a writing desk was put in front of him. Now what would be suitably horrific? Over 50 damning. Elaine bit her lip in thought. Clearly the Sincian were planning something to have that many in one place holding the docks near the Rahad. It was, in some ways, a tempting target. However, she knew well enough, if you wanted to survive, you did not attack where the enemy was strong. Not when you were the weak one. Well, then I suppose that they will just do whatever it is they wish to do, and we will wait for them to leave. If they come deeper into the Rahad, we will make sure we have some surprises ready for them. They could hold the King's Square all they wanted. It was near the docks. The Sincian had plenty of troops and damming to protect it. But if they tried to pursue her people into the Rahad proper, well, then they would start to die. People of the Rahad. The Sincian accented voice boomed out, clearly enhanced by the power. This was new. Elaine put aside the report she was reading on their potato supply to listen. You have stood in rebellion against the Empire for too long. This ends today. Your former queen has aided and abetted you in your crimes against the Empire, and as she wishes to stand with you, she will be allowed to do so. You will assemble in the King's Square in 1 hour to witness the punishment that will face all of you if you continue to rebel against the Empress. May she live forever. Elaine blanched. What horror were they going to inflict on Tylin? Her mind was immediately whirling. Could she rescue her? That would be a blow against the Sincian. No, not with 50 or more dam in there. They would be expecting a rescue attempt. It was obviously a trap, and she could not just walk into it. Her people needed her. Pursed her lips. The Sincian disgusted her on a visceral level, and the more she saw of them, the more she hated them. She turned to the girl who was acting as her messenger today. Put the word out. No one is to go to the King's Square. Let them make their disgusting show to themselves. The Rahad will show its own respect to Queen Tylin. She suspected that the Sincian would be moving into the Rahad proper after this, looking to overwhelm the rebels and take control. She would need her people to be ready. If necessary, they would simply fade away. But all those dammen and soldiers could not stay together in the smaller streets and passages of the Rahad. At the end of the hour, other than the Sincian, there were only a very few sullen-faced men and women standing around, staring with undisguised hostility at the rows of Sincian soldiers, and Queen Tylin strapped to a wooden frame on a raised platform. The Dursoldum bowed to High Lord Devlin, and his voice began to speak. The volume magnified to almost unbearable proportions by the damning. People of the Rahad, your former queen, is an oathbreaker and a traitor to the Empire. For her crimes against the Empress, may she live forever, she is sentenced to die by flaying. Listen to her punishment, and know loyal subjects of the Empire shall be protected, but any that turn against us shall share her fate. Of course, they did not realize the huge honor that he did them by addressing them, even through his voice, or the sheer level of inconvenience that they had caused High Lord Feenan to make him ask his most important military leader to take time away from the siege to clear the traitors from the Rahad once and for all. Tylin's defiance, if she had any in her, would not be permitted to be heard. She would be kept silent, well, until she started to scream anyway. The damning would make sure that the whole Rahad heard that. He looked up, expressionless at Tylin, who stared back at him. Her face was impassive, but he could see the fear in her eyes. With a gesture, he ordered the Dursoldum to begin. It was amazing how long a damning could keep someone alive while they did this. As the terrifyingly loud screams of agony finally stopped echoing across the Rahad, Elaine sagged with relief. That had probably been the most horrific thing she had ever heard. She had desperately wanted to spin a ward against sound around herself and simply block it out, but she could not. Not in front of her people, not as they listened to their queen die. She looked around the room, sure that her horrified feelings would be mirrored on the faces of everyone else in the room, and they were. However, there was also rage, deep, hard rage. She had not thought they cared overly for their royalty here in Abu Dar, but this seemed to have triggered something in them. Even the sea folk looked furious. After a moment, Elaine realized that she was feeling that rage too. How dare the Cincian do something so utterly horrific to someone? They would pay for this. In blood. High Lord Devlin watched another boatload of Suldam, dammen and soldiers unload onto the docks of the Rahad and march on. He turned to one of the officers. Focus the newest ones on the Sezin Island. They know their orders. Search every building. Any weapons, any resistance, kill them. They would clear each island one by one and end the rebellion once and for all. This Lady of Death would die along with her followers. Either they would stand and fight, or they would be pushed back into the Cincian forces holding the outer edge of the Rahad against the Westlands army. The crack of an explosion followed by the rumbling of a building collapsing echoed through the air. High Lord Devlin did not flinch. He was an experienced man. He had commanded Dammin in battle. This was just another such battle, but against cockroaches rather than an honorable enemy. A day after her raid on Abu Dar, Taija was back at the hall. She did have responsibilities beyond blowing things up after all, when someone knocked on her office door. Come in. Nynaeve entered, grim-faced, with one of the initiates. Taija thought his name was Calran, but she wasn't totally sure. With the hall growing so fast, it was hard to keep track. He looked like absolute shit. He was wearing his formal coat, but it was filthy and he looked like he hadn't eaten properly for days. Did he run away? Taija thought he'd been around long enough that he'd be allowed to leave. What in the light happened to you? Sit down, quickly. She looked at Nynaeve. Is he all right? What happened? Calran bowed to Taija before half collapsing into a chair. Thank you, Taija, said I. Aye, words seemed to fail him, and Nynaeve smoothly took over. He was on a recruiting party. It seems that they ran into a group of Cincian with the same thing in mind. Taija's brain came to a crashing stop. You mean over here, finding women to leash? Nynaeve nodded, and rage flashed through Taija. That was even worse than she'd thought. Something needed to be done, or they'd just be coming and enslaving channelers with impunity. She couldn't allow that. Ignoring the morality of it, which was bad enough, they'd be getting stronger every day while weakening her own continent. It needed to be stopped. Taija's mind was whirling, and after a moment she realized with a spark of guilt that she was ignoring the two people in front of her. Sorry, I'm just shocked. Are you all right, Calran? What happened to the others? It was Nynaeve that answered again. Inalez dead. That sent a spike of pain through Taija's heart. She'd been one of the first to join the hall. So's Barand. We think Dilna was put in one of their filthy collars. Calran successfully hid and waited for us to come looking for the missing party. I'm so sorry, but you survived, Calran, thank the light. He looked down and muttered, No, I ran like a coward and left them to die. Taija immediately shook her head. No, Calran, you survived and were able to warn us about what was going on. Without that, we might not know. You're an initiate, not an aspirant or Aes Sedai. You just have died. You did the right thing. He didn't look convinced. Nynaeve, please make sure that Calran is looked after. He's been through a traumatic experience. He's excused classes until he feels ready to go back to them. Then please could you summon all of the Aes Sedai in the hall? We need to talk about what we're going to do in response to this. Taija hesitated. See if you can get Rand here too. This was bigger than just the hall.